Hey guys, Young Drummer here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. A couple of you have been asking me to do this drum set up next in the list of drum sets that I have to review. And this is my late 40s, early 50s Slingerland Radio Kings in 13, 18, and 24. Have a listen and we're going to get into what's going on with this kit. Get into it. Hopefully the audio is good enough on the drum set. So these are my Slingerland Radio Kings. These are the oval bats that date from around 1949 to like 1952. Mahogany, poplar, mahogany on all the shells. I've paired it with a WFL Snare drum that has pretty much the same ply. Yeah, so I think this is actually mahogany, poplar mahogany again. And it's an interesting fun fact that if these Slingerlands did not come with a wrap, and if they did sort of like a clear finish on the outside, the most outer ply would have been maple, which is actually what I have going on with this snare. This was originally a Ducko WFL Snare, but basically why I bring that is just basically why I bring that up is that the shell construction from Slingerland to Ludwig at the time is kind of similar in that way. But I'm going to be throwing a lot of stuff out at you guys. And a Slingerland, many of you know, but if you're new to Slingerland Radio Kings, kind of like I am, that the Radio King snare drum, the coveted Slingerland Radio King snare drum, was basically, I think it was a steam bent single ply of maple, which was very different than the tom construction. And that's pretty much what makes those snare drums coveted. It's a huge, chunky one ply of steam bent maple. All right, so that's that. Let's get into how I got the kit. I got the kit off Craigslist, and I was in the market to buy a drum set. I've been wanting some Radio Kings. I wasn't intentioning on I wasn't going to keep the drum set. I was basically going to restore the drum set, restore it back, clean it up, and basically flip them. Because sometimes I'm doing that, but sometimes with my drum addiction, all good intentions go into it. And like with this one, is I kept it. So I'm going to ramble on a little bit, but basically, a great guy that I had met off of Craigslist who sold me some drums prior, a year before, and kept my number. And he had mentioned that he had his grandfather's Slingerland kit from the 40s, and my eyes went up, and I didn't hear from him, and finally he just reached out to me out of the blue after about a year and a half and said, I'm ready to let go of these. Let me turn my snares off. And I met him, and they were just basically they were pretty dingy, but they were amazing, and I paid him good money on it, and what blew my mind is I don't think he let me know this, but it came with a snare drum that was a Max Roach Gretsch snare drum. I believe it was a 14 by 4-inch snare drum, a very coveted Gretsch snare drum from the early 50s. And I was just tickled to get that. So, and there's the interesting story about this drum set is he was telling me that basically his grandfather was a working drummer, and that he would play weddings around Main Street, USA, where I'm from. So I'm really feel close to the drum set just because it's part of history of where I grew up and where I was from. And so essentially his grandfather was a gigging musician, probably had a day job, and just sort of on weekends and at nights would, play weddings. But he also told me that when he wasn't playing a wedding, sometimes he would moonlight at burlesque shows. So this is also, this drum set spent a lot of time sort of, being the accompaniment music for strippers, which just basically seems wild to me. And he let me know that, but what he didn't really, and usually when you get a drum set, from this era, usually comes with a trap case, which is just basically a bunch of basically broken sticks, some wire brushes, some just basically some duct tape or whatever the working drummer had. But what was fascinating to me is it came with a lot of the trap kind of stuff, basically L-arms for cymbal stands and noisemakers, and it had a horn, it had a ratchety thing, almost makes me think of Bugs Bunny, sound effects kind of stuff. Came with all that stuff, but it also came with basically some set list, and I'll throw some pics up of this guy's set list that was in his trap case, and just fascinating to me, because basically if the drum set dates from if this drum set came out between 1949 and 1951, basically this guy was probably a gigging drummer from the 50s up until sort of through the 60s. And the set list that he has for what I anticipate, or what I kind of believe would be sort of the wedding set list, is stuff like Cabaret, Up the River, Shining Stockings. I don't know these songs. I'm basically a classic rock guy. But apparently, doing a quick YouTube search on these are jazz standards. So basically, I just picture sort of a school jazz drummer playing weddings, but also moonlighting as being the pit drummer for strippers, essentially. So, and I'll throw pics up of these on, but basically some of his notes in beautiful cursive handwriting is the sunny side of the street. And what I love about it is just basically that there's these little sort of notes that are unlike some of the notes that I would trade with my young musicians, and basically like sort of in the modern era of like we do this twice. So there's a lot of like notes about halftime, that there's a tag, and that kind of stuff. So essentially these set lists, I've broken them down into sort of wedding set list, and then there's one set list from the burlesque shows. And a woman named Barbara Lee, I'm assuming that she would have this typed up. This is the days before Xerox, so she would like sit down and type up her set list, and essentially whoever the drummer was that night, that she would hand off these to like the sort of guys doing the music. So it's this basically like her act essentially was a tune called Satin Doll, and then something called The Watermelon Man, a drum solo with a long roll with 2 rim shots, and then going into Pop Goes the Weasel. It's just fascinating to me. It makes me think of sort of like, you know, like kind of Betty Boop kind of stuff. And basically like there's this, you know, 8 bars of street beat, and I'm wondering if that's, you know, just something that people knew what that was at the time. And if you know any of what I'm talking about in the comments, if you know the music, the swing stuff, the 50s and 40s, and if you know any of this stuff. And lastly, the 6th song of our set list was something called Colonel Boogie, which I didn't know what it was, and then, but it's really essentially, it's kind of like a march that everyone knows. You've heard it a bunch of times. It's almost like a 4th of July kind of like sort of vibe to it. And I was just fascinated by this. And at the bottom it said strip, same as the first show. So it's just like, you know, just a huge chunk of like sort of people who were working in this area in the 40s and 50s as musicians and just entertainers. So I just loved that this stuff came with the trap set. And something that I can't decipher, this is pretty beat up. It seems to be his own handwriting of some more jazz standards, and it's something that he would sort of write on the fly with more kind of musical notation. And, you know, the other thing, going back to the wedding stuff, is I really think it's kind of like sort of like jazz standards, Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, kind of going into the 40s, into the 50s, and into the early 60s. Tunes like Day by Day, and I don't really know that. I know that the very sort of, you know, I know like things like Falling Leaves and stuff like that. Sunny Side of the Street, You're Nobody, For Once in My Life, It's Wonderful. And if you YouTube, if you don't know this music and you sort of, they're really sort of romantic type stuff, really appropriate for a wedding. And if you YouTube these things like Satin Doll from the stripper set list, you really get a sense of like sort of the cute raciness of the music. So anyway, love that part. And, you know, really, I'm a big history fan. I'm a history guy, so I just love these sort of very human elements to the drum sets that I come across. So there's that. So 1949 to 1951, the round, and I'll throw pics of all this stuff. And let me get into the restoration. So I got the drum set, and again, I was originally thinking of really cleaning it up, restoring some missing parts, and flipping it. And what happened is I did all that, did all the work. I cleaned. I think it took me a week to clean the tobacco grime of like decades of gross grime that of just basically being in the smoke of the era. And the hardware is nickel, and I was able to have that come back to life as best as I could. I find that nickel deteriorates and it's harder to polish than something like chrome, where I feel like chrome is more sort of inclined to really pit. So got the drum set, paid him good money on it. I was thinking of doubling my money, of selling the whole thing, and I knew that I had some more money in the snare drum. Cleaned the whole thing up, spent about a week cleaning it. The only real structural problem was one of the maple bass drum hoops had a crack in it, and I got some wood filler and did the best, and I got it sort of structurally sound again. I cleaned all the hardware. I soaked it in something called Grease Lightning. Very careful to not soak nickel more than 24 hours in that, just because sometimes the nickel will almost oxidize and you might get this greenish, you know, where sort of the qualities of whatever the chemistry is happening there. So you really can't soak those things too long. Some people don't soak, some people soak in Dawn, but I like Grease Lightning because it sort of it cuts down on my polishing time. Grease lightning is stuff that you can, and I'm not endorsing grease lightning, but stuff you can get at Home Depot, and it's what people clean their grills with. Like restaurants use that stuff, industrial stainless steel kind of cleaner. And when you soak drum parts in it, the rust and the grime just kind of like will just ooze right off. No, you're not oozing off metal, but I really, really like it, and I learned that tip from a friend a long time ago. Soak it, and Dawn does sort of the same thing too. It just, what I like about grease lightning, it cuts down on my sort of like my polishing time, and especially where I don't really like using fine steel wool. I find that really does a good job of really getting the decades of crud off of these things, as best as I can. But basically these tension rods, I don't leave them in for too long. Tension rods are kind of covered with rust, so I was going to be selling, it's not a mint kit, not a museum piece, and I was going to be selling it as a player's kit, but selling it as sort of the coveted Radio Kings that they are. So, you know, did all that footwork, took a bunch of pictures, and then I just threw the heads of what I kind of had laying around, assuming that the buyer, whoever I sold it to, would want to put whatever, like, their preferred heads. I didn't have any issues with fitting the heads with modern drum sets. These are not oversized like Gretsch in my experience. But to make a long story short, so I basically put the heads that I had lying around on the drum set, and I just basically said, well, I'll give them a whirl before I'll sell them. And I fell in love with them. I even sort of, these are very old heads that I had on there, and I just think it was sort of the music of the Spears that I just love the tone I was getting out of these things. And like, you know, I've been here before where I'm caught, where I was intending on flipping the drum set, and lo and behold, I was just sort of heartbroken. I'm like, I can't sell these. So I contacted the seller, and I just basically said, you know, I mentioned that I'd probably be restoring this thing and flipping it, but I don't think I can. They're too good. And I sent him pictures of the restoration project that I did, and he told me he got emotional seeing his grandfather's kit come back to life. So, but there is, you know, like the happy end of the story is I still had that Max Roach snare drum, which was just a huge chunk of drumming history that sort of was, Max Roach endorsed his own personal snare drum with Gretsch, I think in the late 40s, early 50s, and you guys who are more Gretsch guys can really correct me on that. So essentially I was able to sell that snare drum and get my money back. So essentially I had these 13, 18, 24 to myself. So everybody's happy. The other piece too is that this usually would have come with a 16-inch, and this is an 18 by 18. 18 by 18? Yeah, 18 by 18, 4 legs, because it's a beast. And I don't know if that was sort of a custom build. I don't know if the original drummer had a 16 and then added an 18 later. But it is sort of Slingerland. And oh, now that I'm thinking about it now, is the rim on this guy is not the same as the rim on the tom. So in other words, this might have the Slingerland Radio King engraving. I think it does. Does it? All right, let's take a look. It does. So it's just basically an earlier, maybe they didn't make these sort of stick chopper. Well, these were the thickest stick chopper at the time. But these are, you know, in other words, if you look closely on the 13-inch, they have the holes to hold the tension rod, and on this 18, it's all clips. So I'm just, you know, sometimes when these things left the factory, who knows about what they were just basically kind of putting together. But maybe they didn't have the 18-inch engraved Slingerland Radio King hoop with the holes to hold the tension rods. So basically, I'm going to be rambling, so I'm going to be probably discovering things as I'm doing this video. So that's how I got the kit. Mahogany, poplar, mahogany. I'm going to open up one of these bad boys and we'll show you the bearing edges. But a little bit about the hardware is these were, I believe that these are called the Slimline, I think they were called super lugs, which then they developed the nickname of beaver tail lugs, which I believe that Rogers also has a beaver tail lug, but these are the Slingerland ones, or what they call it, just basically like, it's like an Art Deco design that fans out, gets a little bit fatter on the bottom, more thinner at the top. My research tells me that these lugs are pot metal. I believe that they're made out of zinc and then covered with nickel. And then looking at the catalog pics, I believe that you could also get them covered in chrome. around that time, and I'm pretty sure that these are nickel. The tension rods themselves and claws, the claws, they kind of remind me of 60s Ludwig kind of claws, but they're distinctly different. And the tension rods themselves kind of have this bow tie thing going on. They're really, really kind of cool looking. I really do like the badge. It's not the cloud badge, but the badge has a little more kind of design. Okay, so I lost power. So we're back. I would think I was talking about the badge. And forgive me if this repeats. Let me come around the other side. So the badge, 1949 to around 1952, 1951, this is the oval badge. And it, for me, I believe it kind of have a similar font to the cloud badge. After that badge, there were two, it seems like over the years, this oval got smaller and smaller. The next oval badge reminds me of when you go to an arcade and you put a penny in the grinder thing and you flatten out a penny. It just sort of looks like kind of a cheap metal thing. Usually had an aluminum grommet, I believe. And then after that, it got a little bit more fancy. And the one after that, in the really late 50s, early 60s, I believe, switched to the more classic Slingerland gold and black 60s oval badge that we all know. Okay, so where was I? Isn't she cool? What else to talk about it? Maybe I can show you guys. The hoops come engraved. There we go. Which is very cool. It's just something I really love, that it's just sort of an added thing where they stamped Slingerland Radio King right into the nickel-plated hoop. And if I was a good doobie and a little bit OCD, I would have matched the top one up with the bottom one. The 13-inch tom would have hung off of, this is the remnants of the tom mount, which would have hung off the hoop, which in my mind, it must have just either been awkward, or I always like sort of wondering how much stress you put on that hoop. And I believe I got rid of the thing, but I left this on there just for aesthetics, just because it sort of would have left a hole. And eventually one day I'll probably take it off and maybe get a plate and just kind of make it a little more pretty. When I restored these, I don't know if you can kind of tell, the wrap is wonderfully yellowed. And what I had done, it's kind of got a little bit of a shine to it, but what I did to get the years of grime off, and the purist, or, you know, just depending, I'm not trying to insult anybody here, is just really depend, they're your drums, so you do what you want with them. That's my philosophy. And what I had done, and some people hate this, is that I used a very fine wet sand approach where you just sprinkle water on it and you use like a 300 grit sandpaper, and I sort of kind of, when you do that, you're going to get all the grime off, but you're also going to get some of the plastic acrylic, which becomes kind of a milky thing going on there. So just be careful that you don't do it too much. And that's what got the wrap back into sort of more of a presentable kind of finish. I mean, I got this light off to my left right here, and you can kind of get a gleam or a little bit of gloss off of that. And then as you go around this drum, I think it became a little bit, it's not too bad. But there are some more yellowed spots than others on this drum kit. Like right there, like I think, I don't know if you could pick that up on the camera, looks to be like a little bit of like wrap cancer. This is what I love about the history stuff too, is like the original owner would use Scotch tape and just tape his set list to, and I couldn't get all that residue off there, but I kind of did my best. So I also painted the hoop. No, did I? I don't think no, I wouldn't have painted the hoops if the residue's on there. I think they were kind of in good enough shape. But I even did this inlay, and that's some, like, you could see some of the discoloration from the tape. And the inlay I did also wet sand as best as I could. On these did not, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself, these kind of drum sets at the time, some did, some didn't, they did not come with a spur mount or telescoping spur. In the catalog, you would have paid extra for a set of spurs. These are mount hooped, and Are these Slingerland? No, I don't. I think that they're just either like made in Japan, cheapos, or whatever. But I really love these. I find that even on modern drum sets, if I have slippage, it looks goofy, but I might put these on the hoop because I find that they're kind of tried and true, and they work incredibly well. I actually think that they work better than the old school 60s Ringo bass drum anchor. So, like on my 60s Ludwig kit, I have these Denmar things that come out and they have a pointed spur that go right into the ground. And it's actually not enough, so I might throw these on there. As always, I have my bass drum a little bit lifted where the front lugs are about a ½ inch off the ground. I just learned that trick and I find that the bass drum resonates a little bit more. What else to tell you? So there are on the bass drum. The floor tom. Floor tom is a beast. It's an absolute beast. Down here, if you can see this is a bit of styrofoam. I have 4 of these to make sure that the drum resonates. And you can go on eBay and buy these rubber feet that go at the bottom of your floor tom leg so that the floor tom kind of floats. And I don't like muffled drums at all, so I really like sort of the drum to sing. So that's a trick that I will do on many of my bass drums, especially when it's vintage and straight-legged. Oh, what happened there? Oh. And that's a trick there. There is basically some wrap issues on the 18 where it's lifting up around the seam and stuff, and there are some gouges in it, but it still looks pretty cool. And these are the clips. Let me see if I can find you guys the engraving. I think it's over by this mic. Is it? Yeah. And there you go. Maybe that's not going to come up. Oh, there it is. Slingerland. And probably I would have done the same thing because I'm a geek down here. Did I? No, good for me. What else? What else to say about it? A little bit about the snare drum. The snare drum that I played that you'll hear on the recording. Again, mahogany, poplar mahogany, just as the shells of the Radio Kings that I have. I wanted to kind of match up in that way. And that is a WFL Ludwig snare drum from the 40s. There's no stamp on the inside, but these, I'm sure some of you guys know this, these are called Zephyr lugs that sometimes strip, but I got lucky and these work. I have some brass, chrome over brass hoops going on there. And you might notice in the recording that the snare drum is a little bit bright because I have an ambassador on the top as well as an ambassador on the bottom with 24-inch pure sound wires on there. Why I have an ambassador on the top of these is just basically I find if I have an emperor on top of a snare drum like this, it just to my ear that the emperor kind of just doesn't allow the drum to ring enough, and that's just personal preference. I really like drums to sing. I don't like a lot of muffling. But to contradict myself there, I have a moon gel up here on this 13 because of this 13. I don't know if it's because I have an emperor on the top. I actually have like a Ludwig silver dot on the bottom, but this thing was just basically had like 2 minutes of decay. It was the most ringy drum set. I think with this camera it's not going to work because this camera distorts sound-wise really well. But just trust me, is that this was the most resonant 13-inch drum I've ever played in my life. It just went on forever and ever. I believe that people really love the Slingerlands because they have this like drum boogie thud to it. And I think that may not come across with the heads that I have on. I'm more of a rock guy, so what I have on here is I have an Emperor. This was not by choice. This was just the heads that I had lying around. An Emperor, yeah, just like coated Emperor 2-ply. And on the bottom of this thing, maybe I could show you guys this, is, I think, just as a side note, is that, let me put this guy down over there and flip this around. This is what's kind of a Bob Ross, a happy accent about this thing, is I tend to have a hard time tuning the 18-inch floor toms that I have. I have 3. And I had this Evans hydraulic it's really old school. Like it's sort of when they first came out with these things, either in the 60s or 70s or even the early 80s, but the Evans people would know. Um, and I just threw it on there, and I think that this bottom head is so thick that it does a really good job controlling the sound of this beast, because I feel like I got a happy place with this drum, because again, most of the 18s that I have, it's almost like it's just sometimes it just feels too much. I don't know if you guys have that same experience with an 18-inch floor tom, because I find that it's either it doesn't really sound good tuned high, but getting the lower registers to be focused and controlled and not sort of like wonky or wobbly is hard. Hopefully that made sense to you. And there are 4 legs on this guy, and the hardware is pretty. It's old, and I have a hard time. It has this clip thing, not really a clip thing. It's sort of a wing nut, and it's actually hard to get the post through there. So I have to kind of fiddle it with it every time I want to take it apart or put it away. And I believe that these are the original clips that go with that. So hang tight. I'm going to open up these drums, and we'll get into the bearing edges and the plies. So just we're going to pause. Okay, okie dokie. So what we got the heads off. So let's get into what's going on here. So already there's this, one of these things is not like the other. The 13-inch, and I remembered from when I first started restoring this, is that the bearing edge and the reinforcement rings are very different. Where the 18-inch, why am I out of breath? Maybe it was that time sped up thing. All right, so see that beautiful ripple in the mahogany? Isn't that just amazing? And you know what? Can you guys smell that? You can't smell it, but I can smell it. It smells amazing. So where was I? The bearing edges. This is kind of more of a very classic standard bearing edge. I don't know if that's 45 degrees, but it reminds me of a Ludwig from the 50s and 60s. Just basically not super sharp, but not just sort of rounded over like a baseball bat that the Slingerland went to in the 60s or even earlier. You guys might be the more experts there. But what's really interesting is the 13-inch has these, let me get that light out of the way, these Mamma Jamma reinforcement rings going on. So much that the lugs, these two are for one of those lugs, and that it's the washers. There's only one washer per lug that has a Slingerland stamp on it. And those washers, I don't know if I can get in there, some light in there. Some are pretty shiny. And this bearing edge is more kind of rounded. It doesn't really have this sharp kind of angle to it. I don't know if you guys can kind of see that. Going on with the 24 and the 18. So that's one thing. Just basically a very different shell construction on the 13 than the bass drum and the floor tom. When I run my hands over it, that bearing edge feels really, really good. And let's see, can we get into the plies? Where I can see it with my eye is that dark ribbon before the drop off of the reinforcement ring. There's your mahogany, and there's kind of the grayish, spongy looking stuff in the middle of the poplar. And right at the wrap line, there's your sandwich of the other ply of mahogany. Rich mahogany. Okay. I wonder if there is, no, I don't really see like either an inspection note. There's no stamp. I don't think that they stamped these, but just a really beautiful shell. some shiny stamped Slingerland Radio King washers. What do they say? Do they say like USA, Chicago, Illinois? Slingerland, Chicago, Illinois. You hear that? That's mahogany. All right. Anyway, I think I'm getting punchy in the video. I should probably start the videos. So reinforcement rings, a bearing edge that almost reminds me of a modern bearing edge, kind of slants down. Again, just what's really, I'm getting better and better at recognizing plies. There's the wrap, there's the mahogany, there's the poplar, there's the mahogany again before you get to the maple reinforcement ring. And just really beautiful craftsmanship. There's the badge. Okay, coming over to the floor tom is same construction. You can kind of get the little sliver of mahogany right there. Moving to the poplar, mahogany again, maple reinforcement ring. And why do I feel like there was an inspection kind of pencil on this one? I might be confusing it with another drum. There you have the muffler. Recently caught that these are gray felt mufflers, and I think that over the years the colors did change on those. Originally maybe in the 30s they might have been green or something like that, or even red. And there you have it. That's the inside. No dates on the inside, the washers, and there you go. So what else to say about this thing? So, you know, I would never sell the drum set. I'm totally in love with the drum set. You could see the fade of the wrap underneath. Would have came with calf originally. And the lugs that got cleaned up. And there you have it, guys. I think I'm done. So that's your Slingerland Radio Kings. Hopefully the audio was good enough for you guys. Subscribe to the channel, ask questions, correct me if I'm wrong on stuff, and hopefully you enjoyed the video, enjoyed the history. And if anyone, if anyone knows what's going on with why the reinforcement, or what was going on with these leftover shells of an earlier era, or if you have a Radio King drum set and you have more of the reinforcement ring that looks like that, I'm definitely not complaining. I'm just more curious about it. And again, I'm wondering if this bearing edge, I'm wondering if the construction of this is the reason why that this 13-inch tom was just singing like a mofo. And again, I'm not complaining about it. And there's my Ludwig silver tom from the 70s as a reso on this, and yet still sounded amazing to me. All right, guys. And again, probably where we are, see that stack of blue right there? That's my most recent drum set. That's a Gretsch Broadcaster. That is 3-ply, and that's probably going to be my next video unless somebody can convince me to do the 70s Slingerland. And what's left? Back in that corner, there is one of my first restorations, and probably the hardest restoration I've ever done. That is my Teardrop 1960s 2016 13 with a matching snare, and I veneered the whole thing using an iron of all things. Anyway, lots more to go. So, you know, comment, subscribe. What do you guys want to see? But my vote is to do my Broadcaster next because that's sort of what's on the list in my mind. But if you could steer me wrong, we have the option of doing the 70s Slingerland kit. That was a total nightmare. That is a player's kit that I spent some time with. Or the Sonar way over there. All right, guys, take care. Bye-bye.